The sky over Massachusetts bled a sickly gray as Elias Monroe pulled his car to a stop in front of the decrepit Victorian house. Blackwood Hill stood quiet, its dying trees scratching at the wind like skeletal hands, and the house itself looked like it had been clawed out of the earth centuries ago. Moss grew thick around the crumbling porch, and the windows, most of them cracked or entirely opaque with dust, seemed to watch him. Elias stepped out, slamming the door behind him. The noise echoed too long for comfort. "This is it," he muttered, adjusting the strap of the bag over his shoulder. "Let's see if ghosts make for good company." He was a man who made his fortune from the dead, at least on paper. His novels had terrorized readers for over a decade, each tale darker and more grotesque than the last. Critics called him the maestro of the macabre, but Elias always felt like a fraud. He didn't believe in ghosts. Not really. Horror, for him, had always been fiction. Until recently. His newest idea had obsessed him for months. A story based on real events, a love that defied death, a woman's soul forever tethered to the mortal world. He had come across the name Lenora Whitmore in a Civil War-era journal, an entry from a soldier who mentioned the ghost bride who still dances under the moonlight, waiting for her lost beloved. The house she once lived in, this house, had remained untouched for decades. It called to him like an unwritten final chapter. So he came. The inside smelled of mildew, paper, and old secrets. Floorboards groaned under his boots as he walked through the dim foyer. Peeling wallpaper hung like dead skin from the walls. A chandelier, still adorned with cobwebs, swayed gently overhead though the air was still. He found the study, dusty but intact. Heavy curtains blocked most of the afternoon light, and a cold draft seeped through a cracked window pane. An antique desk waited in the corner, layered in dust, a dried ink bottle still resting on its surface as though time had paused mid-thought. He dropped his bag, set up his laptop, and began to type, letting the silence settle in around him. In the heart of the forested hill stood a house that time had tried to forget. But love remembers. As soon as he finished the line, the power flickered. A single bulb above him buzzed to life, briefly, before dying again. Elias frowned. "Coincidence," he whispered, trying to shake off the chill crawling up his neck. He stepped out into the hall and froze. From upstairs, where no one should be, where no stairwell remained intact, came the soft, unmistakable sound of footsteps. Not heavy, not aggressive, but light, deliberate, like someone walking barefoot across the floor above. He held his breath. Tap, tap, tap. The rhythm was steady. And then, music. A soft humming carried through the air like fog. A woman's voice, low and sorrowful, vibrating with something ancient. He couldn't place the tune, but it made his bones ache. Elias grabbed the flashlight from his bag, cursing under his breath, and headed toward the remains of the broken staircase. He could just make out the rotted remnants of steps curling upward into blackness. "Hello?" he called out, half expecting his voice to vanish. The humming stopped. Silence. He backed away, heart pounding harder than it should, and returned to the study. The laptop screen was black. He tapped the keyboard. Nothing. Then, in slow, jerking pulses, words began to appear on the screen. "You brought me back." He froze. He hadn't touched the keys. His hands were still at his sides. Then another line appeared. "You wrote me awake." The air around him grew thick, dense with a cold that wasn't natural. The smell of lilies filled the room. Sweet and rotting. And then he saw her. A reflection in the dark window behind his desk. A girl in a black dress. Skin like moonlight. Eyes like polished glass. Her mouth moved, lips forming silent words, tears streaking down her pale cheeks. He turned, there was no one there. The air was still. But the mirror on the wall, long covered with a tattered curtain, began to rattle. He stood rooted, unable to look away. Behind the fabric, something moved, slowly, deliberately, like a hand pressing against the other side of the glass. And then it stopped. The laptop beeped once more. "Let me tell our story." Elias backed away slowly, heart hammering, sweat cold on his back. He whispered to the empty room, "What the hell is happening?" Outside, the wind rose again, moaning like something mourning beneath the trees. And from somewhere in the attic, a music box began to play. A tune of longing. A tune of love. A tune of death. Elias Monroe did not sleep that night. He tried with the determination of a man who needed to believe in logic, who needed to believe in fiction. But every time his eyes fluttered closed, the same image returned. A woman floating just behind his reflection. Her mouth moving without sound. Her gaze locked into his like she was trying to remember something, or make him remember. The clock struck 3:33 a.m. when he gave up. He left the bedroom, what used to be the house's guest room, judging by the faded floral wallpaper and rusted bed frame, and stepped into the hallway. The old boards groaned beneath his feet, but this time they weren't the only sounds. Somewhere above, again impossibly above, came the soft creaking of a rocking chair. Back and forth, back and forth. Elias stood motionless, listening to the rhythm of wood against wood, a lullaby from an empty room. But then came the whisper. At first it was indistinct. A breath, a rustle, the kind of sound your brain writes off. But as he stepped toward the staircase it grew clearer. He never came home? A woman's voice. Despair soaked every syllable. Elias stopped at the foot of the ruined stairs. The top of the stairwell was shrouded in darkness, yet he could feel her up there. Watching. Waiting. He turned away. Not yet. At sunrise, Elias made coffee so black it tasted like burnt ash and sat back down at the desk in the study. He opened his laptop. The file he'd started the night before, The Ghost Bride, was gone. Instead, a new document had been created. It was titled, Our Story. He hesitated, then opened it. Only one sentence sat blinking on the screen. If you truly want to write this, you have to see through my eyes. Below it, a single link. Not to a website, this house hadn't had functioning Wi-Fi in decades, but to a file. An audio recording. Elias clicked play. What came through his speakers made his blood turn to frost. Sobbing. A woman's ragged breath, choking on tears. Then singing. The same melody he'd heard the night before. A child's lullaby but warped, dragging as if sung from the bottom of a lake. Sleep now, my heart, sleep under the rain. Love lost to war will not rise again. Then silence. And then, Elias, I remember you. The voice spoke his name. His name. Not someone else's. Not the name of a soldier long dead. He slammed the laptop shut, heart pounding like a drum in a thunderstorm. This wasn't research anymore. This wasn't a ghost story. This was personal. Later that day, Elias forced himself to investigate the attic. He found a rusted ladder in the cellar and used it to scale what remained of the stairs. The door at the top was swollen shut, and it took all his strength to force it open. What waited beyond was like stepping into a frozen moment of grief. The attic was preserved in impossible detail. Dust blanketed everything, but nothing had been disturbed. A rocking chair sat by a shattered window, where pale morning light filtered through dirty glass. An old mirror leaned against the wall, taller than Elias, its frame cracked but its surface strangely pristine. He saw himself in it barely. Then, as he stared, the room behind him shifted in the reflection. The mirror no longer showed the dusty attic, but a lavish room lit by candlelight. There she was again. The woman, Lenora. She wore a deep crimson dress this time, embroidered with delicate roses. Her hair fell in long black waves, and her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. She reached out toward the glass. Don't forget me. Her voice echoed inside his head, inside, like it had been placed there, not heard. He blinked and the image was gone. The mirror once again showed the cold, lifeless attic. But Elias wasn't alone. A small wooden box now sat at his feet, where nothing had been a moment before. He knelt, hesitating before opening it. Inside, nestled in yellowed lace, was a faded letter and a silver locket. The letter read, To my dearest, if you find this, then our story has not yet ended. You promised me forever, even if death would come between us. Find me. Finish what we began. I remember the field, the music, the promise. LW. His breath caught. He flipped open the locket. Inside, instead of a photograph, was a blackened fingerprint burned into the metal. A faint whisper spilled out as he touched it, forever. He dropped it. It hit the floor and split open. From within, something slithered out, not a creature but a sensation, like a fog of sadness and longing curling up around his legs. Suddenly the mirror lit up again. 100 faces stared back at him. Men, women, children, all of them screaming without sound. Trapped behind glass. Trapped in her world. And in the center of them, Lenora again, no longer serene. This time her mouth was wide open in a silent scream. Her skin cracked like porcelain. Her eyes rolled back, black and endless. Her hands slammed against the mirror from the inside, again and again. Write it. The mirror shattered. Glass flew out in every direction, but when Elias turned around, the mirror was whole. Untouched. Like nothing had happened. He ran. Out of the attic. Down the stairs. Out into the freezing morning air. He stood in the yard, gasping. But even outside he could still hear her voice. "Oh, gentle. If you leave, I'll follow." The rain hadn't stopped for 3 days. It drummed relentlessly against the roof like ghostly fingers tapping in impatient rhythm. The trees outside clawed at the windows, skeletal branches scraping the glass with a sound that might have once been mistaken for wind, until you heard the whispering underneath. Elias hadn't slept much since the letter arrived. The ink had faded slightly, but the words carved themselves deeper into his thoughts each night. "You promised me forever." He stared at the paper as though it might blink. The handwriting looked old, graceful, elegant, but unsteady, as if written by a trembling hand. There was no return address. No postmark. No explanation. Just a name at the bottom. Lenora Whitmore. And the worst part? The name stirred something. Something familiar. The dream repeats. That night, Elias fell asleep in his study, head resting on a pile of blank pages. He dreamed again. The same dream. A gray field of withering white daisies stretched endlessly beneath a sunless sky. There was no wind. No sound. No color, except the pale white dress of the woman who stood at the center of it all. Lenora. She stood with her back to him, unmoving, almost too still to be human. Elias called out, but no voice came from his throat. He walked toward her. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the earth itself resisted him. Finally she turned. Her face was beautiful, timeless, and wrong. Her eyes were empty. Not blind, but absent, as if her soul had drained from them centuries ago. "You left me," she said. Her lips moved slowly, her voice hollow and distant, like a voice from beneath ice. "You said we'd be together. You promised." Blood began to seep from her mouth. "So why am I still here, and you're not?" He tried to run. He couldn't. The ground beneath him had turned to soft mud. No, not mud. He looked down. It was hair. Human hair, black and wet and writhing. He screamed. And woke with a gasp. His desk was soaked. Not with sweat. Not with spilled water. But a single perfect white daisy sat on the page in front of him. Still fresh. Still wet. The hidden room. The next day, Elias wandered the house like a sleepwalker. He didn't remember getting out of bed. He didn't remember eating. He only remembered the dream and the whisper that lingered after it, "Come back to me." It was sometime in the afternoon when he leaned against the bookshelf in the library and heard a click. A faint mechanical sound, out of place in the silence. One of the shelves shuddered, then creaked open, revealing a narrow passage, a door that had never existed before. Elias stared at it. Felt wrong. The kind of wrong that settles in your bones. He stepped inside. The room was small and square, barely large enough to stretch out his arms. No windows. No lights. Yet somehow, it glowed faintly with a soft, gray luminance, like moonlight underwater. There were portraits on every wall. Dozens of sketches, paintings, and faded photographs. Every single one depicted the same woman. Lenora. In some she smiled, radiant and alive. In others she wept, her features blurred by charcoal streaks. And in one, Elias's breath caught. She was drawn in death, her throat slashed, flowers blooming from the wound like a grotesque bouquet. On a small wooden table in the center of the room lay a journal. The cover was dark red leather, cracked and brittle, as though it had been scorched in fire and then left to rot. Elias opened it. September 12, 1902. Elias kissed my hand beneath the orchard tree. He smelled of smoke and ink. He said he would write about me one day. I said I didn't need a story, I only needed him. He blinked. My name. My handwriting. My kiss. He flipped to another page. February 19, 1903. He no longer remembers me. I see it in his eyes. Something took him from me. But I will not let it have him. He belongs to me. And another. October 31, 1904. I bound our souls together with blood and ink. He will return to me. Even if he forgets, even if he runs, this story has no ending but mine. The final page was blank. Until, right before his eyes, words began to appear, written in invisible ink, bleeding slowly into visibility. Welcome back, Elias. We begin again. Fragments of the past. He staggered out of the room, gasping. He ran to the mirror in the hallway. His reflection stared back, pale, shaken, eyes hollow. But it wasn't his reflection. The clothes were wrong. The face was slightly off, more angular, dressed in a 19th century coat and vest, blood on the lapel. The reflection smiled. Elias screamed and threw a book at the mirror. It shattered, the glass exploding like ice. Behind the shards was not drywall or plaster, but a brick wall, cracked and engraved with names. One of them. Lenora Whitmore, died 1905. Murder or suicide? The house shifts. The house began to change after that. Doors led to the wrong rooms. The kitchen disappeared for hours. The staircase led to endless loops. Windows no longer showed the outside world, only thick fog and shadowy figures that stood too still. At night, the phonograph played by itself, an old waltz with no source. Elias tried to unplug it. The cord was missing. And every night at exactly 3:33 a.m. the phone rang. Always the same silence. Except now, there was breathing. Soft, rhythmic, like someone on the other end was sleeping. Or waiting. Her arrival. On the 7th night, he lit every candle in the house and waited. He sat in the study with the journal on his lap, a fireplace burning behind him, though the heat never reached his skin. At midnight the flames dimmed. The room grew colder. The shadows deepened. And then, she stood in the doorway. Lenora. Pale, beautiful, terrible. Her gown floated inches above the ground. Her eyes shimmered with longing. One hand clutched a withered daisy. The other was covered in dried blood. "You finally remember?" she said softly. Elias couldn't move. Couldn't speak. "They tried to separate us. Life. Death. Time. Memory. But I kept writing. And now, you've written your way back to me." She stepped closer. "Come with me, Elias. Back to where the story paused." Her hand reached for his. "You owe me a forever." Elias woke with a scream trapped in his throat. The early morning light seeped through the curtains like a ghost crawling into the room, pale, cold, and unwelcome. He sat up in his bed, soaked in sweat, heart racing like prey in a trap. The room was silent now, too silent, as though the house itself was holding its breath. But the dream still clung to him, like a film over his skin. Lenora's eyes glowing in the dark, her hand reaching from the other side of the mirror, her voice saying his name as though she'd always known it. He rubbed his eyes and stood slowly. The journal still sat on his desk. The fireplace was dead. The typewriter was quiet. Yet he felt watched. Not in the paranoid sense, but something deeper. Older. As if a presence lingered just beyond the veil of the visible, breathing in unison with him. A house that remembers. He wandered through the house, each step echoing louder than it should. The wood beneath his feet seemed to moan, not from age but recognition. In the hallway, a picture frame he'd never hung now rested on the wall. A charcoal sketch of a woman in a Victorian dress, seated beside a piano. Her face was turned away, but he knew it was Lenora. Her hand rested gently on the keys, and though it was only a drawing, Elias could almost hear the notes. He hadn't put it there. He stood staring until a chill crept up his spine, forcing him to move. Every object in the house now felt suspect. Every book he hadn't opened. Every mirror he hadn't looked into. There was a history here he didn't know, or had forgotten. And it was waking up. The return of Dr. Vale. That evening, as rain hammered against the windows, the doorbell rang. Not a soft chime, but a long, sharp, almost angry buzz. Elias hesitated before answering, dread bubbling in his stomach. He opened the door to find Dr. Miriam Vale, soaked to the bone, her face pale beneath a dripping hood. "You shouldn't be alone tonight," she said. Without waiting for an invitation, she stepped inside. Elias closed the door and turned to face her. "What are you not telling me?" She didn't meet his gaze. Instead, she placed a thick, weather-worn leather tome on his table. It was locked with a rusted clasp, the surface embossed with strange runes and faded initials. L.W. "This," she said quietly, "belonged to Lenora. The truth in the pages." With a whisper of ancient leather, Miriam opened the book. The pages inside were yellowed and brittle, filled with hand-drawn symbols, diagrams, and entries in an elegant, obsessive script. Candles flickered though no window was open. She kept a record of her experiments, Miriam said. Seances. Rituals. Attempts to reach her dead fiancé. "She said she loved me," Elias murmured, voice hollow. Miriam snapped her head toward him. "What?" "In the dream. In the journal. Her letters. She said she loved me. She said, we knew each other before." Miriam's face paled further. She turned the book to a page near the end, one written in two different hands. One was Lenora's. The other, darker, slanted, not quite human. The ink bled at the edges like it resisted being read. The page was titled, "The Binding of Time, a Union Beyond Death." And beneath it, "You will return in ink and blood. The one who writes shall become the written." She wasn't trying to contact someone, Miriam said slowly. She was trying to preserve them. Trap their soul in the narrative. Resurrect them through story. Through obsession. Elias's breath caught. You think she's writing through me? No, Miriam whispered. I think she already has. Writing in the dark. That night, Elias sat before his typewriter once more. He tried not to, but his hands moved without his will, possessed by rhythm and hunger. Each strike of the key echoed like a heartbeat. The story poured out, not from memory but from somewhere deeper. He walked down the hallway of his own house, but it was no longer his. The walls bled memories. The mirrors whispered names. And at the end of the corridor stood the woman he had once promised to love, now bone-white, with lips stained red and eyes hollowed by centuries of longing. He stopped. His fingers hovered above the keys, trembling. The air behind him grew colder. And then he saw it, the last line typed without his touch. Turn around, my love. He turned. And she was there. Lenora. Dressed in white lace that fluttered without wind, her hair long and dark like ink dripping into water. Her face was beautiful, but ruined. Her eyes hollow, black as drowned stars. Her mouth twitched in a smile both tender and terrible. I've waited so long, she said. Elias could not scream. Could not move. Her hand reached out and he took it. The vision. The moment their hands touched, the world collapsed. He was no longer in his house. He stood in a ballroom lit by candlelight, filled with silent dancers. Each moved in slow, perfect circles, faces blurred as if time had forgotten them. Music played, soft, haunting, impossibly sad. And across the room Lenora waited for him. She wore a veil. Beneath it, her skin was gray and cracked like ancient porcelain. But her smile was full of love. Do you remember now? She asked. Flashes came, stabbing through his mind like needles. A vow spoken beneath a moonless sky. A hidden ritual. A fire and the smell of roses burning. His voice crying out her name as the earth swallowed her. I failed you, he gasped. You did, she whispered. But I've given you another chance. Her hand slid behind his neck. This time, stay with me. And she kissed him. A choice between worlds. Elias awoke on the floor of his study, alone. But his reflection in the window showed Lenora standing behind him, her fingers brushing his shoulder. And when he turned, no one was there. On the desk lay a new page, fresh from the typewriter. He no longer knew which world he belonged to, the one with beating hearts or the one with lingering souls. But he knew one thing, the story had claimed him. And below it, scrawled in that same dark ink as Lenora's journal, to love a ghost is to become one. The storm had not stopped for 3 days. Wind howled through the narrow streets of the small Massachusetts town like a chorus of mourning souls. Rain lashed the windows of Miriam Vale's study, and the sky outside remained a perpetual bruised gray, as though time itself had paused in grief. Miriam sat hunched over a desk cluttered with parchment, books, and worn photographs. Her fingers trembled slightly as she turned the page of Lenora's journal, now a cursed relic that exhaled cold air with every breath of its cover. Elias hadn't returned her calls. His house was dark. No movement. No heat signature. No trace of life. But he was not missing. No, something worse had happened. He had crossed over. The whispering mirror. The journal crackled as Miriam traced her finger along a passage written in a faded, spidery script. To bind a soul to a story is to imprison it in remembrance. But if the writer bleeds, if he dreams deeply enough, the door will open from the inside. She glanced at the old mirror propped up beside the desk. It had been part of Lenora's belongings, one of the last things removed from the estate before it was condemned. She had placed a veil over it days ago. But tonight something pulsed behind the fabric. A faint glow. A whisper soft and pleading. Slowly, with fingers stiff from fear, Miriam lifted the veil. What she saw was not her reflection. It was Elias. Standing in a ballroom again, but this time, his face was wrong. His eyes glowed like coals behind frost. His lips moved but no sound emerged. Behind him stood Lenora, her smile wide, predatory, possessive. Miriam staggered back. And the mirror cracked. Just once, a thin silver line spreading like a wound across the glass. The researcher's regret. Miriam had always prided herself on logic. A parapsychologist. A skeptic who demanded proof in a world full of delusions. But now the truth was undeniable. Elias was trapped. Not dead. Not alive. Imprisoned in a liminal space, crafted by love, obsession, and ancient rituals. She returned to the book and flipped to the last few pages. There, drawn in blood, was a sigil. A symbol of reversal. A gate. Only the bonded may call him back. Only one who remembers love without possession. Only one who does not fear the silence. The instructions were clear. To reach Elias, she would need to enter the hollow hour, a forbidden time when the veil between the worlds weakens. Midnight. But not just any midnight. She had to wait until the 5th hollow moon. She looked at the calendar. Tonight was the 5th. The séance. The storm raged on as Miriam prepared the ritual. She used the attic of her small home, which once served as her laboratory for testing psychic phenomena. Tonight, it would become a battlefield between the living and the dead. She lit 5 black candles and placed them in a circle. In the center, she placed Elias's manuscript, a lock of his hair, taken from an old comb in his home, and Lenora's journal, its pages vibrating with unspoken hunger. The sigil was drawn in salt and ash. As the clock struck midnight, the flames flickered unnaturally. Shadows stretched and twisted on the walls, growing teeth, eyes, memories. Miriam sat in the center, palms up, chanting in a whisper. Through ink and bone, through dream and dust. Return the lost from pages unjust. Speak his name not once but 3. Elias Graye returned to me. The candles hissed. The manuscript rustled. And the air split like cloth torn from the heavens. The door between. Miriam found herself standing in the in-between. A place of cold white fog, silence so loud it pressed against her skull, and shifting fragments of memories floating like ash. She moved forward, calling his name. Echoes repeated her words, warped and mocking. And then she saw him. Elias stood beneath a rotting tree, its branches hung with pages torn from his story. His eyes were glazed, his mouth sewn shut with shadow. Lenora stood behind him, now monstrous in her beauty, her jaw slightly unhinged, her eyes black wells of sorrow and rage. You shouldn't be here, she hissed. He chose me. He was tricked, Miriam replied, voice steady. You buried him in fantasy. Lenora's expression darkened. I gave him eternity. Miriam stepped forward, holding the journal out before her like a weapon. He is not your puppet. Let him go. The sigil on the journal blazed with light. Lenora screamed, a sound like shattered glass and weeping violins. The fog writhed. The ground cracked. Elias began to shake violently as the stitches of shadow unraveled from his lips. He looked at Miriam and spoke her name. The escape. With the last of her strength, Miriam threw the journal into the void. Flames erupted around it, engulfing Lenora in a vortex of light and ash. The tree exploded. The ground fell away. And Miriam grabbed Elias's hand. Together they fell. Through memories. Through forgotten dreams. Through every word he'd ever written. And into the real world. Aftermath. Elias woke in Miriam's attic. He was weak. Pale. But alive. The manuscript was gone. The journal had turned to ash. And outside, for the first time in days, the storm had passed. Sunlight crept through the windows like a benediction. But the house felt different. Somewhere in the shadows, something still watched. In the mirror, the crack remained. A reminder. Elias had not written a word for weeks. He sat in his study, the room quiet except for the occasional creak of the old house settling. The windows were closed, yet the wind still found its way through the cracks, whispering stories of the past. The storm had passed, but something darker lingered. His fingers hovered over the paper, but every time he tried to write, his thoughts turned inward, swirling like smoke in the empty space between memory and reality. He had returned from the hollow hour. He had escaped Lenora. But the world he'd returned to felt incomplete. There was a silence inside him, a space where words should have flowed freely but now felt suffocated, choked by the weight of the experience he could never fully escape. Miriam had been his anchor, guiding him through the darkness. She had kept him tethered to the living world when every part of him wanted to drift away. Yet she had warned him, "You're still here, Elias. But the part of you that left with her, it might never come back." He wasn't sure if he could ever forgive himself for what he'd done. For summoning Lenora. For giving her form, voice, and life when he should have known better. But even more than that, he couldn't forgive himself for what he had wanted. A part of him had wanted her. Not just the ghost of her but the idea of her. The way she had filled the emptiness inside him. The way she had made him feel seen, wanted, as if for once, someone truly understood the darkness that lay in his soul. The gift of the pen. It was late one evening, as the last rays of sunlight were swallowed by the horizon, that Elias sat at his desk again. Miriam had gone for the night, leaving him alone in the house. He didn't need her to guide him now. The pen was in his hand. His fingers itched to write, but what could he say? What story could he craft that would make any sense of what had happened? His heart beat louder in his chest, a rhythmic sound that filled his ears as if daring him to put it all down. He looked at the mirror across the room, the one that had once trapped Lenora's soul. The one that still reflected something he couldn't quite name. It had been cleaned, polished, no longer cracked. But it seemed to watch him still. And in its silence, he heard her voice. Write the ending, Elias. He shuddered, almost afraid to move. Was this a ghostly echo, or was it his own subconscious calling to him? He didn't know. But what he did know was that the story was far from over. He could not allow it to be. Not for him. Not for Lenora. The Hollow Hour's reflection. Elias took a deep breath and began to write. His hand moved almost instinctively, the words flowing as if the pen had a life of its own. The pages filled with memories of the Hollow Hour. Not of the ghostly horrors or the twisted love of Lenora, but of the truth he had come to understand. The ghosts we summon are not always the ones who haunt us the most. The ones we fear are the ones who live within us. The shadows of regret. The ghosts of choices made. He wrote of the hunger for connection, the terror that came from feeling truly alone. He wrote of his own obsessions, of how they had almost consumed him. And how, in the end, it was the acceptance of his own imperfection that saved him. The end of the story. Days passed and Elias didn't stop writing. When he finally finished, he sat back in his chair, exhaustion weighing on him like a stone. The room was silent, but the weight in his chest had lightened. The book was done. The story was no longer a haunting, it was a resolution. Elias knew the world would see it as a horror novel, a tale of madness and possession. But for him it was something else. It was a love letter to the darkness he had faced, and to the peace he had found in confronting it. The release. The manuscript was submitted and soon enough the Hollow Hour was published. The reviews were mixed. Some readers found it too disturbing, too raw. Others praised it for its honesty, its unflinching look at the internal demons we all carry. But what no one knew was that, by the time the book was out in the world, Elias had already moved on. He had already buried the story within himself, allowing it to settle like dust on old memories. The only thing left was a quiet understanding. Lenora was gone. And so was the ghost of his need for her. The last reflection. Years passed. Elias moved away from the town, away from the house that had once been his prison and sanctuary. He traveled. He wrote. He lived. But sometimes in the quiet moments, he would catch a glimpse of himself in a reflective surface. A mirror. A window. And in that fleeting moment he would see her again. Not Lenora. Not the ghost. But something else. Something more profound. The person he had become. He understood now, we are the stories we tell ourselves. And in that story we are both the ghosts and the living. The haunting and the healed. He wasn't afraid of the reflection anymore. Epilogue, the final line. It was late one night many years later when Elias sat by the fire, his hair now silvered with age. Miriam had long since passed away, her wisdom and quiet strength a distant memory, but her words had stayed with him. Write the ending, Elias. And as he held his pen, he knew she had been right. He wrote one last sentence in his journal. The words, written with an old, steady hand, were simple, but they held the weight of everything he had learned. In the end, the story is not about the ghosts we face. It's about the light we find in the darkness. And with that, Elias Graye closed his journal for the final time. This story is a work of fiction.